All right, well, imagine a society that is just embarking on this process of development and modernization. It's entering stage 2 of its demographic transition. In places like certain parts of Western Europe, this happened several centuries ago. In regions, for example, sub-Saharan Africa, this really didn't begin until the 20th century. But some pretty radical social changes start taking place. For one thing, we see the first wave of urbanization. People are migrating from rural areas into cities, and cities are getting bigger. We see the economy begin to diversify. New sectors emerge, and not everybody is a subsistence farmer anymore. We might start to see basic improvements in education, healthcare, nutrition. The extended family might begin to fray, and the nuclear family starts popping up in places. And the result of all these changes is demographic change. The earliest sign of demographic modernization is a precipitous fall in the death rates. Historically, the number one reason for that was a decrease in infant mortality, which has a major effect on the death rate. On the other hand, birth rates tended to remain high at fairly traditional levels during this stage. If you look historically, the death rates just responded earlier. They fell earlier in the process of modernization because death rates, and particularly things like infant mortality, respond fairly quickly to some basic changes, some fairly simple changes in things like infrastructure and healthcare. Birth rates, on the other hand, for birth rates to fall requires some more fundamental changes in social structure, and that just played out over a longer period of time. So the gap between birth rates and death rates began to widen. That is to say, we start seeing more natural increase, and as a consequence, population growth begins to accelerate. And that process of modernization continues. At some point, the birth rates begin to decline, and then you're into stage 3 of the demographic transition. Think about a society where urbanization has proceeded fairly far, so we've now got large cities. The economy has continued to diversify. The majority of people are probably no longer employed in agriculture. There may be an industrial sector, there may be a technology sector. The service sector may be growing to be the largest sector of the economy. Standards of living have improved, healthcare has improved, education has improved, infrastructure has improved. You still see continuing improvements in things like infant mortality, so the death rate continues to decline. But the birth rate begins to decline even faster, and as a result, that gap between birth rates and death rates begins to narrow. That is to say, natural increase begins to diminish. And the population continues to grow, but it grows at a decelerating pace. A very large number of countries in the world today are in stage 3 of the demographic transition. As birth rates continue to decline, at some point they reach the level of the death rate. So natural increase becomes 0. And that signals stage 4 of the demographic transition. As countries continue to develop and mature, the death rate may actually rise higher than the birth rate for reasons that I'll explain a bit later on. And when that happens, population growth becomes negative. The population actually begins to get smaller. There are quite a number of countries in the world today whose populations are now decreasing. I haven't said anything, or at least not much yet, about why birth and death rates change with this process of modernization. And I'll get around to that eventually. But meanwhile, let's just see how the world is doing toward the completion of its demographic transition. And if you plot the position of the world overall, you see it's somewhere near the beginning of stage 3 of its demographic transition, with a 1.2% annual rate of natural increase. But if you break that down by subregions, in terms of levels of development, here's what you see. The more developed countries of the world have only a 0.2% rate of natural increase. They're sort of right there poised at the very end of stage 3, and a number of them are already into stage 4. If you look at the less developed countries of the world, excluding China, somewhere toward the very beginning of stage 3 with a 1.7% rate of natural increase. And if you look at the least developed countries of the world, they're still back somewhere in stage 2, growing by natural increase at about 2.4% annually. And I'll add some individual countries to the chart, just selecting a few of the more populous countries from different regions of the world. So I'll put the United States up here toward the end of stage 3, and also Nigeria, the most populous country in sub-Saharan Africa, in all of Africa as a matter of fact, with about something a little over 150 million people. And Nigeria's got a 2.6% rate of natural increase. Their population is going to grow by something approaching 90% between now and mid-century. And here's Egypt, the most populous country in North Africa, 1.9% rate of natural increase. And we'll throw in India, with a population approaching 1.2 billion. India is going to become the most populous country in the world within just a few years when it overtakes China. And you can see India's farther. You can see that India is farther into stage 3 of its demographic transition, with a rate of natural increase of only 1.6%. But they're still expected to gain something between 500 and 600 million people between now and mid-century. And we'll throw in Mexico, farther into stage 3, and Pakistan, still way back, really at the very beginning of stage 3, population growing by 2.3% annually. And here's Turkey, and I'll throw in Brazil, the most populous country in Latin America. Here's China, a bit of an anomaly. And finally, I'll add 3 countries that are in stage 4 of the demographic transition model, and have populations that are decreasing. There's Japan. Japan actually shows a 0% rate of natural increase, but that's a rounding anomaly. Japan's rate of natural increase is slightly negative now, and they're going to lose about a quarter of their population between now and mid-century. Here's Germany, also with the decreasing population. And finally, Russia. The former communist countries of Europe are a little bit of an anomaly in terms of the demographic transition model. Their populations may be decreasing for slightly different reasons. But in any case, there's Russia. Now, all of these countries have progressed in their demographic transitions. They've moved rightward on that timeline, and they're likely to continue doing that in the future, but at very different paces. If you're concerned, as I am, about the prospect of global overpopulation, then we obviously want to see these countries move toward the completion of their demographic transitions as quickly as possible. But that's where the problems emerge, because that progress depends really on the pace of economic and social development and modernization. And that pace varies widely between the different subregions of the world. Certain parts of Latin America and Southeast Asia are moving very quickly. On the other hand, regions like Sub-Saharan Africa and a number of countries in South Asia have tended to lag farther and farther behind. What I want to do next is talk about why these changes in birth rates and death rates take place with the process of modernization. And to understand that, you have to understand what goes into the determination of birth and death rates. So that's what I'm going to turn to next. Birth rates and death rates are each determined by 2 factors, one of which they share in common. Birth rates are determined by fertility and by the age and sex structure of the population. Death rates are determined by mortality and the age and sex structure of the population. I'm going to talk in this video a good deal more about birth rates than death rates. So let's look at birth rates, and that first determinant, which was fertility. Fertility refers to the number of children that women in a given population are having. And I think it's fertility that most people tend to think of immediately when they think of the global population growth. There's a kind of misconception that's pretty widespread that the world's population is growing because women, especially in the developing world, are having just insane numbers of children. And for the most part, that is a misconception, as I'll show later on. But in any case, there are different ways of measuring fertility in a population. The one I'm going to use is what's called the total fertility rate, or TFR. And TFR is a bit of an abstraction. It's what's considered a synthetic indicator. But it's a way of representing what women at different stages of their childbearing years are doing at a given moment in time. And here's a kind of simplified way of thinking about it. Let's say a woman enters her reproductive age this year. For statistical purposes, that begins at 15 years of age, so she turns 15. And then she goes through the childbearing years of her life until she reaches 49. And let's say that over that period of time, she has the number of children that you would predict based on current fertility trends. That's the total fertility rate. Of course, any individual woman is unlikely to follow 2009 fertility trends as she moves through the next, 34 years of her life, because fertility trends are dropping. So A woman turning 15 this year is likely to have fewer children than the total fertility rate would lead you to expect. So as I said, it's a synthetic indicator, and that's as much as I'm going to complicate that discussion.